So now that we've given an overview of what a semaphore is conceptually, now that we've talked a bit about the structure and functionality, it's time to actually talk about the stuff you can program, which are its methods, its key methods. It's actually got a lot of methods, as you can see. We're just going to talk about some of them. So here are arguably the most important methods in Semaphore: acquire, acquire uninterruptedly, try acquire, and release. And in fact, I think for your programming assignment, you have to use acquire and release. But I'll talk about all four of these things. All of these methods simply forward to the appropriate instance that inherits from the abstract queued synchronizer, either fair sync or non-fair sync. So all those things just kind of forward, and that's why it's the bridge pattern. Oops. The acquire method is used to obtain one permit from the semaphore atomically. So all these things are carefully designed to avoid internal race conditions. The acquire method can be interrupted, and that becomes important for your program because if you're waiting to acquire a semaphore and the user clicks the cancel button on the GUI, we want the program to shut itself down rapidly. We don't want it just to sit there and hang. That would be annoying. So this is something that can be interrupted. Acquire uninterruptedly, in contrast, also allows one permit to be obtained, and it'll block if it's not there, as does acquire. If the count is 0 or less, it'll block. For both these things, they block if there's nothing there. If the count is greater than 0, they'll acquire the semaphore and decrement it atomically. The difference between acquire and acquire uninterruptedly, which is really quite a mouthful, is that acquire uninterruptedly cannot be interrupted. So once you block there, you are blocked until you get that semaphore or until you decide to shut the whole thread or program down. So this cannot be disturbed, whereas this one can be disturbed. Try acquire attempts to obtain a permit if it's available when you invoke the try acquire method. So what it's basically doing is it's a non-blocking call. So I should put a little icon here of my football player blocker with a red X through it. So this is non-blocking. This particular method is kind of funky. If you call this method without a timeout, which is this call, this method will barge. What that means is, even if you've set the fairness policy to fair semantics, you say, I want a fair semaphore, it's got a queue. If you use the try acquire and the semaphore is available, the thread that calls try acquire will get it, which isn't fair, which is also not intuitive as far as the semantics. Don't ask why they did it that way. That's just what they did. There's also a way to have fair try acquire as well, which we'll talk about in a second. And then the last method that's sort of core to the semaphore interface is the release method, and that automatically and atomically increments the permit count by 1. And remember, it's possible for the permit count to exceed the initial permit count. Might be a little weird, but you can just keep sitting there going release, 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 release. And about the only reason you'd ever do that is if you started with the semaphore being negative, which itself is kind of weird. What I should point out here is that when you release a semaphore, if the count goes from 0 to positive and there's anybody waiting to get the semaphore, they will be awakened and they can go ahead and get the semaphore. So release increments the count, and it has the side effect, if there's anybody waiting for the count to go greater than 0, they will get a chance to decrement. And who gets, if there's multiple threads waiting, who gets that semaphore depends, of course, on whether it's fair or non-fair in terms of its semantics. So those are the main methods. There are also a pile of other methods that are part of the semaphore interface. I'm going to talk about some of them briefly. We're not going to use them in the class, but they're worth being aware of. Some of these methods can acquire and release multiple permits simultaneously. So we have acquire uninterruptedly, try acquire and release. Notice each of these takes a permit count. So you can wait to get n, or permits number of semaphores. And you can do that either interruptibly or uninterruptibly. You can try to acquire a certain number, you can release a certain number, and so on and so forth. And then there's also a couple of timed try-acquire methods. So these are non-blocking methods that honor the fairness setting. So they don't allow barging. So if you want to do a non-blocking acquire that will honor the setting and you don't want to wait at all, you can simply call try-acquire with a timeout value of 0. Again, I'm just mentioning this for completeness. It's not very common to do this, but it's in the API.